Hello YouTube. Bane666 here. As most of you probably know, I started this series of videos to expose the lie that Elliot Rodger was connected to the men's rights movement. But I am now expanding it to cover any falsehoods, misconceptions, misinformation, or outright lies spread about the MRM. So let's get stuck into it. You know, I was actually hoping I was done with false claims that Elliot Rodger was an MRA, or that MRAs are the same as PUAs. I mean, I have dealt with this false claims so many times in this series, that I'm just sick of it, but here is another one, just waiting for me to pull it apart. It's actually from months ago, published just after the first International Men's Rights Conference. Somehow it must have slipped past my radar. Anyway, let's get this over with. Anti-Feminist Karen Straughan Does Not Give a Shit. By Lisa Duda. And was published on the Flounce. The first International Conference on Men's Issues in Detroit last week has given a facelift to a movement that, until recently, I mostly associated with misogynists and lunatics on pathetic internet forums for pickup artists and mass murderers like Elliot Rodger, lonely men in the darker corners of the internet.
My head I'd be scratching while my thoughts were busy hatching if I only had a brain.
Wow. It's only the first paragraph, and already Lisa has resorted to using two strawman arguments, and some shaming language. There's journalistic integrity for you. Let's start with the lonely men in the darker corners of the internet line, which is nothing but attempted shaming language. Let me be honest here, Miss Duda. Insinuating that the only reason men's rights activists are men's rights activists is because they are lonely, is absolutely no different than a troll claiming that feminists are only feminists because they don't get enough dick. You, Miss Duda, have just placed yourself on the same level as trolls, using shaming tactics to silence debate, instead of using logic and reason, based on actual evidence. That's an instant fail in my book. And I haven't even touched on the false claims associated with the pickup artists and Elliot Rodger. As I have dealt with these claims so often in the past, I am hereby creating a new internet law, hereby known as Bane's Law. Bane's Law states, any journalist resorting to falsely associating the men's rights movement with either the pickup artists, or with Elliot Rodger, falls into one of two categories. 1. An incompetent, cut-and-paste journalist, who is either too lazy, or too intellectually backward, to check out the claims of others, before cutting and pasting them, and presenting these false claims as factual. This is the better of the two categories. 2. A dishonest, intellectually bankrupt, propagandist, who has zero interest in reasonable debate, facts, evidence, or integrity, and instead relies on misinformation, half-truths, and outright lies, to hoodwink their audience. And if you disagree with this assessment, Miss Duda, feel free to provide actual evidence for either claim. Name one men's rights website, group, or YouTube channel that is in any way linked to Elliot Rodger. Or provide any evidence that men's rights activists are in fact the same as pickup artists. Of course you won't, because you can't. So I guess the question is then, which category of Bane's Law does she belong in? The lazy incompetent journalist, or the dishonest scum-sucking propagandist? Well, if we look at the About the Journalist part of the page, it states, Lisa is a freelance writer and journalism student living in New Paltz, New York. She has written articles for XO Jane and In Transit magazine, as well as several local publications. Currently, she is working as a research assistant for an upcoming biography about Jen Wenner, the founder of Rolling Stone magazine. She keeps trying to use Twitter, but it's just not her thing. Her poetry can be found on divinudadrags.wordpress.com. Oh, so she is studying journalism. I'm guessing they have taught her the importance of checking sources? Maybe she was sick that day. Or considering the quality of journalists we seem to be getting these days, maybe they have cut that part out entirely. It's interesting to note that she is also a research assistant, which would suggest that she is capable of research. Presumably, In the case of the first paragraph of this article, she either thought research was too bothersome, or would go against the false scenario she was trying to paint. Either way, it's a fail. Next. However, most of the speakers on the first full day of the Men's Rights Conference were women. One of these women was self-proclaimed anti-feminist Karen Straughan. Straughan is a blogger, known by her YouTube handle, Girl Writes What. She proudly stated in the beginning of her speech that she has been anti-feminist long before identifying as a men's rights activist. Straughan has short, cropped hair and is involved in the LGBTQ movement. She is quick to point this out, because she doesn't want her fellow MRAs to judge her by these qualities. She says that although she is not a feminine-presenting person, she is certainly not a feminist. Why? Because feminism isn't even an equality movement. Everything I read that comes from feminists is backwards, wrong, and comes from a set of unfalsifiable hypotheses. Straughan's argument is essentially the same as most MRAs. She believes that feminism is rooted in a desire to oppress men. She cites examples from history, such as the Seneca Falls Convention, where 40 men showed up to speak and were told they could only listen. She repeatedly states that women are persuasive and powerful, and that this is a problem. You know, it always amazes me when these so-called journalists, feminists or social justice warriors, come out with a men's rights activists think that men are oppressed statement. Oppression is a word usually used by middle-class Western feminists and social justice warriors to describe their issues, many of which are questionable, none of which are oppression. I think the Men's Rights Sydney website sums it up best. We are not claiming that men are oppressed. Likewise, we do not believe that women are oppressed. Outside of specific isolated cases, if you have lived your entire life in a prosperous Western democracy, you have never been oppressed and likely have no conception of what true oppression is. What we are saying is that women are not the only gender that faces discrimination. Both men and women face discrimination, and neither one is uniquely privileged or discriminated against. They are merely privileged or discriminated against in different ways. The difference is in the attention that these get. While society is quick to recognize and address the problems women face, it is highly reluctant to address the problems faced by men. Well said, that hits the nail right on the head. I find it interesting that feminists and social justice warriors project the word oppression onto men's rights activists as a kind of slur, inferring that only their own group has issues, and those issues are not only beyond question, but clearly should be everyone else's priority. And anyone outside of the chosen group couldn't possibly have real issues. Pathetic, really. In all honesty, you'd be hard-pressed to find a larger group of solipsistic bigots on the planet. But let's have a look at what Karen actually said.
My name is Karen, and I am an anti-feminist. Yeah. I know, the short hair and the comfortable shoes really gave it away.
Just a quick note for any feminists or social justice warriors who may be watching, that was what is commonly known as a joke. I realize that you may be unaware of the concept of humor, so I would suggest you look it up in the dictionary. After all, we all know how much you guys love dictionary definitions. Please continue, Karen.
But, yes, I am, and I was an I was a non-feminist my entire life. And I was an anti-feminist before I even discovered this movement. I consider myself an anti-feminist before considering myself a men's rights activist. I am first and foremost anti-feminist. And a lot of people ask me, how on earth can you be an anti-feminist? You are a member of the LGBTQ community. You are a divorced mother who struggles to support her children. You are not a feminine-presenting woman by any means. You are the quintessential feminist. And I tell them, well, one of the reasons I am an anti-feminist is because everything that I read that comes from feminists is backwards. It's wrong. It's upside down. And I just want to clarify that I don't consider feminism to be a movement for equality. I don't consider it to be a goal or, a set of goals. I consider it to be a set of hypotheses, not even theories, right? Hypotheses that are unfalsifiable, that are as predictive of what's going to happen as a coin toss, not even that predictive. And we are basing public policy on this set of hypotheses. We are basing entire branches of academia on this set of unfalsifiable, unproven hypotheses. Hypotheses that can never be proven, right? They can never be demonstrated, and they have never been demonstrated. And I'm going to take a little bit of an issue with something that Warren said. I know, because so many people that I talk to, they say, well, the first wave of feminism, that was about justice. The first wave of feminism was about equality. And I'm not going to argue that there was not a need for some assertion of the rights of women as our socio-political and economic climate and our technological advancement changed, right? We needed an assertion of the rights of women. But you go all the way back to Seneca Falls and the Declaration of Sentiments. And as Warren said, we do not need a women's movement that blames men. It was 1848, and 40 men showed up at Seneca Falls. 40 men wanted to attend that historic conference. And they were told, they were turned away at first. And when they persisted, they were told, okay, you can come in, but you need to sit over there in the back and you need to stay quiet. And then the list of grievances, the bullet-pointed list of grievances was worthy of the most radical and insane Tumblr feminist out there. Okay, and every single one of those bullet points began not with the word the system, not with the word the law, but the word he. He, the history of mankind, has been a series of usurpations by man of women, right? A series of oppressions by man against women. And this and every single bullet point, he has done this. He has deprived us of this. He has attacked us in this way. He has oppressed us, in their words, quote, he has oppressed us on all sides.
I think it's pretty clear that Karen wasn't talking about men being oppressed, nor is she saying that women being powerful or persuasive is a problem, as Lisa Divanuta falsely claims. What Karen was actually talking about was hatred towards men, the idea that men, and only men, are to blame for all the world's woes. What she was talking about is misandry, something most feminists are intimately familiar with. Next. Many of her examples are anecdotal, dredged up from court rulings that took place centuries ago. She even cited an incident in ancient Rome, when women protested a law that banned them from wearing multicolored dresses and more than 2 ounces of gold jewelry in public. According to Straughan, this demonstrated their powers of manipulation. No, not power of manipulation. But it does demonstrate that the feminist ideology of eternal female oppression under the patriarchy is a myth. If women were treated as objects, or slaves, or as one feminist once said to me, pets, then why were they allowed to have a voice? And more importantly, why was that voice listened to? Would you let an object, a slave or a pet, make demands of you? Would you give in to those demands? But let's look at the clip.
He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. Tell that to the women involved in the abolitionist movement. In fact, feminists today often credit the women's lobby for the abolition of slavery. They will literally say, if it weren't for women and the organization of women back then, right, the abolitionist movement would not have been successful. And I believe they're right. I really do. Because women are extremely good at appealing to the government to get things done. I have seen examples as far back as Rome, right? Ancient Rome, where women who felt that they were being unjustly discriminated against gathered in front of the Senate and protested until the laws were changed. Right? There was one law, it was during a war, women were limited. They could not wear a multicolored dress, and they were not allowed to wear more than 2 ounces of gold jewelry in public. And they felt that this was unjust and unfair, and once the war was over, they went and they protested, and the law was changed. The law was repealed. They're very, very, very good at convincing the government to do things. The Women's Christian Temperance Union might have something to say about this bullet point. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. The Women's Christian Temperance Union and other women activists were instrumental in the prohibition of alcohol.
Next, she mentions the white feather movement during World War I in England, where suffragettes pinned white feathers to men who were seen out without a military uniform, thus branding them as cowards. One particularly unsubstantial anecdote was of a young boy who was forced to resign from the military in World War I after he was discovered to be underage. The young boy was walking home, recently returned from the war, when a suffragette found him and pinned the dreaded white feather on his uniform. The boy was apparently so shamed by this woman for his status as a deserter that he immediately re-enlisted. According to Straughan's logic, this one vague story should be enough to prove that women are manipulative and powerful. Although I couldn't find anything online to substantiate this story, I did find some information on the white feather movement. Surprisingly, it was not as one-sided as Straughan would like us to think. While some suffragettes like Emmeline Pankhurst were extremists and took part in shaming soldiers who did not enlist, many others did not. Emmeline's daughter, Sylvia Pankhurst, made a name for herself as a suffragette who campaigned wholeheartedly against the draft. Miss Duda couldn't find anything online to substantiate the story? Really? It took me less than 5 minutes to find the story, and the boy's name. From the book, The Second Sexism, Discrimination Against Men and Boys, by David Benneter. One particularly graphic example of this is the campaign, during the First World War, of British women distributing white feathers, a symbol of cowardice, to young men who were not in uniform. These were distributed even to adolescent boys who were technically too young to register. One boy, Frederick Broom, who had succeeded in enlisting at age 15, fought in battle, was returned to England in a febrile state and then discharged at the insistence of his father, who produced his birth certificate to convince the authorities. Then, while walking over a bridge in town, then age 16, young Frederick was accosted by 4 girls who gave him 3 white feathers. He later recalled as follows: "I felt very humiliated. I finished the walk over the bridge and there on the other side was the 37th London Territorial Association of the Royal Field Artillery. I walked straight in and rejoined the army." Frederick Broom's story also appears in a book called Forgotten Voices of the Great War, by Max Arthur. Wow, really sloppy work there, Miss Duda, really sloppy, and not to mention dishonest, as you exclude the fact that Karen was actually discussing the right to vote, in relation to the draft. How men had an extra responsibility, a very costly responsibility, that women did not. But let's look at the clip.
Now, the grievance that men have excluded women from the elective franchise, that declaration in the Declaration of Sentiments ignores the fact that for the vast majority of history, men did not have elective franchise. Men have not always denied her inalienable right to elective franchise. Nobody has denied her an inalienable right to the elective franchise, because the elective franchise is not an inalienable right. It's a privilege granted by government, right? You don't have a right just from being born. You have the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. You don't have an automatic right to vote just for being a human being. And the period between which all men got the vote and all women got the vote, or at least all white men and all white women, in some countries it was as much as 50 years, and in others it was as little as 10. And it was a recent enough, universal male suffrage was a recent enough development for it to be considered fashionable as well as just. A number of UK suffragettes felt that women deserved the vote and men did not. And they put out posters saying men should not vote, they're only good for war. Okay? They're only good for war. And there was one poster that gave examples of what a woman could be and not have the vote. She could be a mayor, she could be a teacher, she could be a nurse, she could be a lawyer, right? She could be all of these things and not have the vote. And what men could be and not lose the vote, he could be a slave owner, he could be a drunkard, he could be a lunatic, and he could be unfit for military service. And anybody who has any kind of nuanced understanding of the expansion of the franchise will know that the voter rights, was intimately tied to military service. Intimately tied. In 1918, a group of anarchists brought a Supreme Court challenge. They claimed that the draft was unconstitutional. Unconstitutional because it represented involuntary servitude. And the Supreme Court's decision was that the draft was indeed constitutional, and this was their justification. It may not be doubted that the very conception of a just government and its duty to the citizen includes the reciprocal obligation of the citizen to render military service in case of need and the right to compel it. To do more than state the proposition is absolutely unnecessary in view of the practical illustration afforded by the almost universal legislation to that effect now in force. In other words, men purchase their rights as citizens through a reciprocal obligation to serve in the military if they were needed. 2 years after that decision came down from SCOTUS, women got the vote. Obligation-free. 2 years later. And this was at the tail end of a war that killed millions of men on all sides. 10 million men on all sides. Many of them drafted. Right? In Canada, we were very progressive. We included in our conscription legislation an addendum that lowered the voting age to 18, from 21 to 18, for anyone currently or previously serving in the military. Way to go, Canada, right? If you're old enough to die for your country, you're old enough to have a say in it, right? And 2,000 military nurses were among the first women in Canada who were allowed to vote, right? And the other women in Canada who were allowed to vote before universal female suffrage was enacted were women who were voting on behalf of their male relatives serving overseas. The vote and the military service has always been intimately connected. At least it was until women's suffrage. And you can even see that the suffragettes understood that, because many of the suffragettes campaigned for conscription, in favor of conscription during World War I. And others participated in something called the White Feather Campaign, which was a campaign where young girls, anytime they saw a man, maybe even a boy over the age of 15, if they saw him in public and he was not in military dress, they would pin a white feather of cowardice to his lapel and publicly shame him for not enlisting. And one story I was reading on a website, the history of the White Feather Campaign. One father recounted his story of his 15-year-old son who had been sent home from the front for being underage when they discovered that he was not 18. And he was walking through town, and a woman pinned a white feather on him. He'd only been home 2 weeks. She pinned a white feather on him, and in the 20 minutes it took for that child to walk across a bridge, he decided to re-enlist.
Next. One of Straughan's most thorough examples is based on a 1910 New York Times article written by an anti-suffragette. It discusses the changing laws regarding property rights, alimony, and divorce. The article is essentially lamenting the loss of privileges the men had over the properties of their wives and children. Okay, let's look at the clip.
Mrs. Johnston Wood complains that a woman cannot make a binding contract with her husband to be paid for her services, but she does not have to do so. He is obliged to support her. But she can go into any business she pleases, keep all the profits, and still demand support from him. A husband has no claim against his wife's estate for having supported her, but if she supports him, as by keeping a boarding house, and he acknowledges the debt, she has a valid claim for reimbursement against his estate. What Miss Scott was getting at in this article was that between the publishing of the Declaration of Sentiments and New York State's state of law, family law, in 1910, all of the coverture privileges, all of the coverture rights for men disappeared, and all of the coverture protections for women remained in place. And one of the really horrible things, because I was asked yesterday, can you give me a brief history of the men's rights movement? And I think that the journalist was really implying that maybe it was something that started in, 2008. Okay. There were alimony reform movements in the 1910s and 20s because they could not obtain a divorce, but their wife had decided she doesn't want to live with him anymore, and so she would move out, and he would be responsible indefinitely for every single necessity that she had. Even if she had more property than him, he was not entitled to any of that property. He had no right to touch it. She was entitled to his support until the day they divorced, and if it was his fault that they divorced, she was entitled to his support for life or until she remarried, right? And there were men who were stuck in the limbo of legal separation without hope of divorce, and their wives refused to come home, and they were stuck paying, sometimes, paying out the wazoo to support women who were enjoying the single lifestyle while still being legally married to their husbands. Feminists of 1910 believed these laws were unfair to women. Because a wife, here's the thing, this wife who enjoyed full rights of property within marriage as an individual, her property was not marital property. Her property was not shared property. It was her own property as an individual. And her family, her children had no claim to it. Her husband had no claim to it. It could not be used legally to support their household. She did not have an equal right over the family property and the family income. In other words, she did not have an equal right, a 50% right to administer her husband's property and income. He got to choose, unless the court forced him, he got to choose how he would keep his wife with the income and the property that he owned that was the family property. And they considered these laws unfair because women, though they were equal custodians of their children, the father who had the sole financial liability to support these children, he was the one who controlled the child's income and property. And when you're talking 1910 and you're talking children of age 12 going to work, right? Children of age 10 having jobs. They didn't go to school. They had jobs. And it was the father's job to make sure they were fed and sheltered and provided for. I really think it is logical that that child's income and property would be administered by the person with the responsibility to feed and shelter the child. And at this point in New York State, the tender years doctrine was already in place. The tender years doctrine. This is another completely unfair thing.
You'll note that Miss Divanuta didn't try to disprove Karen's statements. Instead, Miss Divanuta just misrepresents Karen's statements. What Karen said had nothing to do with males losing their rights over the properties of their wives and children, but instead losing his rights over shared property. To put it another way, what is hers, and what is his, is hers. Anyone who thinks this is either fair or just towards men, or oppressive towards women, is a fucking idiot. Next. Again, some of Straughan's points are valid. It appears that this particular court case was unfair, and left the husband financially responsible for his children despite the fact that his wife made more money. She cites various cases from the same time where men unfairly lost custody of their children. However, nearly every one of Straughan's valid examples is from the Victorian era. Why isn't she talking about more recent laws? Wow, that's a very good question. Let me think, why would someone who is giving a talk on the early history of feminism not discuss recent history? Wow, that's a hard one, even I can't answer that. Unless of course it was because the fucking speech was about the early history of feminism. Do you think, maybe, just maybe, that could be the reason why? You know, like when someone is talking about the history of 2nd century London, they tend not to talk about Big Ben. Next. Is it because the percentage of divorce cases that end up with equal custody granted to both parents has recently doubled? She links here to a document called Children's Placement Arrangements in Divorce and Paternity Cases in Wisconsin. Let's assume that she is right, and that equal custody cases in Wisconsin have doubled. Does that then mean that cases throughout the Western world have doubled? Is Wisconsin somehow reflective of everywhere else? But I also have to ask, what does a shift in custody cases in modern-day Wisconsin have to do with the early history of feminism? Next. Or is it because, according to Reuters, more than half of divorce lawyers in the country are seeing an increase in mothers paying child support? Alton Abramowitz, president of the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers, told Reuters why more women were being given more financial responsibility. The glass ceiling has been pierced and more women have taken over the financial responsibilities and have been saddled with them as well, said Abramowitz. It is a fact of the way our society has evolved over the last number of years. Wow, I guess we can stop talking about the wage gap myth then, right? By the way, this still has nothing to do with Karen's talk. Next. Straughan manipulates feminist history, and global history, throughout her speech. The glaring irony is that she claims feminism is rooted in lies, hypocrisy, and propaganda. She has a rigid opinion of an ever-changing movement. Honestly, I don't think she is a bigot, or a hateful person. She is clearly a woman with a hunger for social justice, which is why I find it strange that she also aligns with the LGBTQ movement. It seems she either has no idea what feminism is, or has a skewed perception of men's rights. Because true feminism, like every other movement promoting equality, is not about denying men equal rights. Oh boy, where do I start with this garbage? Firstly, I find it amusing that someone who starts their article off with two false claims about the men's rights movement, then has the gall to claim that Karen is manipulating feminist history. And then, Lisa Divanuta claims that Karen is just ignorant about what true feminism is. So let me get this straight, if a guy is a men's rights activist, it's because he's a lonely man in the dark corner of the internet, you know, an Elliot Rodger type. But if a female is an MRA, well, it's because she's ignorant. Ignorant about what the men's rights movement really is, and of course ignorant about the one true faith, known as feminism. No, none of that sounds bigoted, or offensive at all. But I can't say I'm surprised. After all, isn't the core belief of their cult that men can do no right, and women can do no wrong? So if a man goes against their faith, well, that's just because they are bad. But if a woman does so, well, she can't be bad like those males, so she must have been led astray. Poor Karen, trapped as a strong, intelligent, independent woman, when she could be part of a herd of simpering victim cultists. If only she understood true feminism. Next. We have come a long way from the suffragettes. And if Straughan and other MRAs want to define feminism by the actions of women who have been dead for over a century, so be it. Men have committed some of the worst atrocities in history. I don't hold it against their gender. And I'm still a feminist. Yeah, we get it. You are more interested in cultish dogma than historical facts. Yep, can't say anything about the one true faith, got it. After all, I wouldn't want to be called a heretic, I mean misogynist. Hold on, I think those two words are starting to mean the same thing. Next. Towards the end of her speech, Straughan mentions the One Is Too Many campaign against sexual assault with disdain. The power that women have always had, Straughan said, is the power to convince Barack Obama, Joe Biden, David Beckham, all of these male celebrities, that one woman assaulted is too many. Out of context, this statement might sound empowering. However, in the video, it's clear from her body language and tone that this is not the case. She looks and sounds outraged at the fact that these men could possibly be supporting such a cause. Why would anyone, let alone a woman, but anyone, be upset that men are supporting a campaign against violence? Because society still has a long way to go when it comes to taking male victims seriously? It's bizarre that anyone interested in equality would take the stance of, if I can have it my way, no one can. This does not further male equality, it makes them look stubborn and insane. Wow. You know, I'm trying really hard not to devolve into ad homs here, but seriously, I have to wonder, is Lisa Duda a grade A moron? So a campaign about violence that ignores men is perfectly fine in her eyes. But criticizing the campaign for ignoring men is somehow an attack on women. Wow. If she is for equal rights, like she claims, and feminism is about equal rights, like she claims, then why isn't she criticizing a campaign that ignores male victims? I would think that's a fair question, right? Unless she doesn't really care about the suffering of males. What if the campaign only focused on rich white women? Would she support people who criticized the campaign then? Or would she infer that those who wanted a more inclusive campaign are acting like spoiled children? Next. My goal while watching and analyzing Straughan's speech was to try and understand the MRA movement from a woman's perspective. Though she was eloquent at times, the message was as scattered and incoherent as Elliot Rodger's manifesto. She ended the speech talking about how she's called Honey Badger because of that YouTube video about the honey badger that doesn't give a shit. Like the honey badger, Straughan says, she does not give a shit about her critics. And clearly, Miss Lisa Duda has never tried to understand the men's rights movement from a male perspective. Don't you think that maybe, just maybe, that would be a good place to start? But she's not really interested in why males become MRAs. She's more interested in why isn't a female a feminist. After all, they have the yummiest poison Kool-Aid, the side of the People's Temple. Oh, and look, yet another Elliot Rodger reference, you just can't have too many of those, can you? Next. Yet what is the men's rights movement, if throughout an entire 35-minute speech, Karen Straughan spoke only about feminism? She failed to mention any specific principles. She might not give a shit what some feminist site has to say, and that's fine. But her lack of substance leaves me with no better understanding of her movement except that it is based solely on a hatred of feminism. The men's rights movement kind of reminds me of when white people cry reverse racism, or express outrage that there is not a White History Month. I'll tell you what, Lisa. When feminists stop holding fire alarms at MRM lectures, when they stop producing faulty statistics, when they stop demonizing males and masculinity, and when they stop writing bullshit articles, which are nothing more than poorly researched propaganda, then we'll be happy to ignore you, and get on with the business at hand. Next. Men have been the dominant sex for centuries when it comes to having rights and power over women. The history of human life on this planet has been a men's rights movement. What do men need so desperately to defend? What basic human rights are being taken away? The conference has not shed light on any grave injustices for men. Instead, it has been a cesspool for bitter individuals who want to find something to blame for their problems, why their divorce didn't go as planned, or why they didn't get that promotion. Feminists are as good of a scapegoat as any. Oh no, here we go with the MRAs don't have any real issues, they are just sad, lonely and pathetic argument. Once again, this is equivalent to a troll saying to a feminist, you are just a feminist because you are angry that you don't get enough dick. Any journalist who uses such an argument is nothing more than a no-talent hack, at the same level as an internet troll. It's just shaming language, designed to embarrass and belittle the opponent, without presenting an actual argument. It's pathetic. And it ignores actual male issues, human rights issues, like circumcision, or justice issues, like the sentencing gap. But Miss Lisa Duda never actually bothered to look at the movement without bias. Yeah, no doubt she will go far in her career. Next. Men's rights activists are concerned because their gender is losing power and control. Feminism began because we did not have any. And today, it is about so much more than a right to vote. It is about being able to walk down the street in peace. It is about not having to put up with sexual advances from our boss just to keep our job. In some countries, it is still legal for men to beat their wives. Yet men's rights activists are upset about having to pay alimony. Wow. It's interesting how she says women never had any power or control, considering Karen gave so many examples in her talk. But then we get to the part where she names 3 feminist issues, which are walking down the street in peace, sexual harassment in the workplace, and intimate partner violence. Predictably, she only sees these as issues affecting women. And she then compares these 3 issues to men paying alimony, in an attempt to dismiss MRAs as nothing but self-entitled arseholes, who aren't interested in any real issues. But you see, 2 can play this game. For example, I could compare this.
This is band bossy, take 1. Pushy.
Stubborn.
Stubborn.
Pushy.
Pushy.
Stubborn.
Stubborn.
Bossy.
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 When I was growing up, I was called bossy.
I think the word bossy is just a squasher.
Being labeled something matters. By middle school,
girls are less interested in leadership than boys.
To this.
Okay? As a way that you'd use it to understand it. No problem. No problem. Got himself up there.
So which issue is more important? Forced genital mutilation, or banning the word bossy? And of course, we could compare this.
Male privilege is the reason why I had to put makeup on, and wear pretty suits, and have pretty nails or prettiness. And why you men can literally just get up out of bed and go to your classes, and people not judge you.
So let's compare that to the gender sentencing gap, where males get vastly longer sentences than females for exactly the same crimes. So which is more important? A blatant miscarriage of justice, or feeling the need to wear makeup? Of course, comparing only minor issues to major issues would be unfair and dishonest, wouldn't it, Miss Duda? Not that I think alimony is a minor issue. although I think it's safe to say Miss Duda does. It's apparent that she has no interest in unbiased reporting, in exploring facts, in finding evidence, in examining both sides of a story. No, she had made her mind up before she even started writing. And everything was thereafter forced to take the shape of her predetermined conclusions. Actually, I think the word conclusion isn't exactly accurate. What she does is better summed up with the word preclusion. She uses the standard feminist ideology of men are the problem, feminism is the solution. Men are always the victimizers, and women are always victims. This type of ideology causes blindness to male issues. And if, by some miracle, you can get one of these feminists to admit to an actual male issue existing, they will always devalue that issue as being less important than female issues, in other words, not important at all. Next. Although Louis C.K. is not a feminist, although maybe he is, I don't know, one of his jokes really captures this sentiment. He's talking about the courage women must have to go out on dates with men. How do women still go out with guys, when you consider that there is no greater threat to women than men? Globally and historically, we're the #1 cause of injury and mayhem to women. He goes on to say about men, you know what our #1 threat is? Heart disease. There is no point in trying to explain to an MRA that their logic is flawed. They don't give a shit. Luckily, as Straughan pointed out, the rest of the world does. Hey, what a great idea, let's ask a comedian what he thinks. Couldn't be worse than some of the clowns that come out of universities with gender studies degrees, I guess. But once again, let's look at the facts, you know, like the so-called journalist and researcher should have. So using CDC figures, the biggest killer of females in the United States is coronary heart disease, then stroke, then lung disease, then lung cancers, then Alzheimer's, then breast cancer, then hypertension, diabetes mellitus, influenza and pneumonia, then colon rectum cancers, then kidney disease, then blood poisoning, then endocrine disorders, then pancreas cancer, then lymphomas, then ovary cancer, then falls, then inflammatory heart, then poisoning, then liver disease, then road traffic accidents, then leukemia, then other injuries, then Parkinson disease, then uterine cancer, then suicide, then other neoplasms, then liver cancer, then diarrhea, all diseases, then congenital anomalies, then stomach cancer, then bladder cancer, then cervical cancer, then skin cancers, and then finally we reach homicides at number 35. In fact, if you look at these figures, females in the United States are almost twice as likely to die from diarrhea, all diseases, than homicide. Not to mention falls, influenza, and suicide. And I should probably note that the homicide figure is not specific to males killing females. So I guess Miss Duda is correct, that is if you exclude the first 34 causes of death, and then presume that all female homicides are committed by males. Which seems about her level of journalistic integrity, doesn't it? Next. So anyway, about 4 or 5 days ago, I was listening to the Honey Badgers, when I heard this, to my surprise.
Okay. Vice reporter infiltrates public meeting. A Vice reporter recently scraped the bottom of the metaphorical barrel for a news story. The reporter decided that he would enter a Voice for Men's forums in hopes of finding rampant misogyny. He then, quote, infiltrated, end quote, a public meeting in a pub to discuss starting a chapter in Melbourne, Australia.
At which point I thought, wow, I was at that meeting.
The reporter wrote of the wounded men he met in the pub and how anti-feminism was a slippery slope. What he didn't know is that the men he felt he'd thoroughly tricked already had him on their radar. Apparently, he stood out like a sore thumb. We spoke with some of the individuals at the meeting who expressed that it was laid back and business as usual. With public meetings in public spaces somehow being newsworthy these days, it only serves to show the desperation of sites like Vice to find a continuous supply of clickbait.
This was all news to me, so I went and found the article. I infiltrated a men's rights group. On Vice. By Kane Daniel. So before reading the article, I was curious as to which person at the meeting this guy was. There was a large number of people who he clearly wasn't. Clearly he wasn't Tom Volts or Adrian Johnson from Men's Rights Sydney. Or Nemo, who is involved with the new Men's Rights Melbourne. Or Jim Muldoon from A Voice for Men Australia. In fact, I very quickly mentally eliminated most individuals at the meeting from my list of possible suspects, and formed my own suspicions as to who he was. So I decided to do a Google search for Kane Daniels. I found that he has in fact written a number of articles before. One of which was titled, How to Take a Shit at a Festival. And another one titled, Where Are All of Australia's Female DJs? Well, I don't think they are working as garbage collectors. For the record, I've known quite a few female DJs in my time, admittedly in the metal and alternative scene, not the dance scene that Daniels discusses in his article. And then I found this. Kane Daniels Bow Tie Tutorial. A step-by-step, illustrated bow tying guide by Kane Daniel. Clearly this is a journalist of great skill, who isn't afraid to tackle any story. Oh, and by the way, my suspicions as to who he was at the meeting turned out to be correct. In fact, I was sitting next to him at the meeting. But I shouldn't poison the well before discussing his article, so let's get stuck into it. I, like most people I know, am indignant at the very idea of men's rights activists. A semi-organized group of men who believe the sinister specter of feminism has inveigled itself into the fabric of culture, society and media. A shadowy Illuminati who have succeeded in making men an oppressed majority. If you've ever had a friend with some, unusual ideas about Jews, then just imagine them talking about women rather than the chosen people and you get the tone. Oh boy. This kind of reminds me of the first paragraph from the article from segment 1 of this video. You know, ignore facts, and replace them with unproven assertions, designed to paint a negative picture. It's kind of funny in a way, because I've always put those who believe in conspiracy theories involving the shadowy Illuminati, and those feminists who believe in the patriarchy, in the same basket. In fact, one of my very early videos covered this.
The Illuminati is an all-encompassing evil that subjugates us all.
The patriarchy is an all-encompassing evil that subjugates us all.
The Illuminati controls everyone, even if they don't know it.
The patriarchy controls everyone, even if they don't know it.
The media is controlled by the Illuminati.
The media is controlled by the patriarchy.
The government doesn't represent the average man because it's controlled by the Illuminati.
The government doesn't represent women because it's controlled by the patriarchy.
It's only conspiracy theorists like myself who know the truth.
It's only feminists like myself who know the truth.
If someone doesn't agree with me, it's because they are ignorant of the truth.
If someone doesn't agree with me, it's because they are ignorant of the truth.
Have I told you about the shape-shifting reptile aliens who have taken over the government?
I bet the reptile aliens are all males, aren't they? That's such a typical male thing to do.
And by the way, Mr. Daniel, I don't know exactly how you think men are the majority, when women make up the majority of the population. And once again, men's rights activists do not claim oppression. That is a word used by middle-class feminists and social justice warriors, who in fact have access to more knowledge, education, choice, freedoms, rights, justice, clean drinking water, abundant food, political influence, sanitation, anti-discrimination laws, and voice to express concern, than any other group throughout human history. Isn't it ironic that those amongst the most privileged in human history not only routinely claim to be oppressed, but also project the word oppression as a slur on any other group with issues or concerns? Next. The idea of a bunch of little man babies screaming about the evil militant feminists stealing their rights feels galling. acting as if the ghosts of radical feminists past swoop into their homes while they sleep soundly under the Matrix Reloaded bedsheets and magically castrate them while they dream of a Doc Marten stamping on a man's face, forever. Oh boy. I know I said this a couple of times in segment 1, but it needs to be said again. Any journalist who resorts to referring to men's rights activists as lonely, or man-babies, or whatever, instead of talking about actual issues, or making a real argument, has placed themselves on the same level as internet trolls who say such things as, "She's only a feminist because she doesn't get enough dick." It's basically the same level of argument, which ignores the real concerns or issues of the group, and goes straight for character assassination and ad homs, on a childish level. It's actually really pathetic. And any journalist resorting to it, has exposed themselves as a no-talent hack. Next. Feminism's reaction to MRAs has not been temperate and, as in all things, those on the edge tend to scream loudest. Theodore Roosevelt once said, "Every reform movement has a lunatic fringe," and it feels like the internet has been handed to two warring fringes. MRAs on one side, radical feminists on each other. An amplification abetted by the media. Ignoring people doesn't get you clicks. I felt there was so much noise and so little signal that all I could hear was screaming. I wanted to know what it felt like to be in a room with MRAs. To try and understand something about them outside of their din of blog posts and YouTube videos. So here his argument can be summed up as, not all feminists are like that, but all MRAs are. Thus acting as a shield to the radicals within the feminist movement, which by the way are not a fringe element. Considering the radicals run gender studies programs at the vast majority of universities throughout the Western world, and make constant appearances in the media, I think it's safe to say that the radicals are far from just dwelling on the edge. And as I discussed in the first episode of my new series, Who Are the Real Feminists, I consider any feminist who believes in patriarchy theory to be a radical. Believing that men are the problem, and feminism is the solution, is a biased, bigoted, and radical point of view. But I have to wonder, does Mr. Kane Daniel have any plans to infiltrate a radical feminist meeting? Of course not, because that might require him to report something negative about his faith, and be branded a heretic. Sorry, I meant misogynist. It's so easy to get those two words confused these days. Next. I found a thread started by a Sydney-based group on the most prominent MRA forum on the internet, A Voice for Men, advertising a meetup in Melbourne. An invitation to meet in a pub or somewhere similar, have a meal and maybe a few drinks, and get to know each other a bit and to discuss the possibility of setting up of a men's rights group in Melbourne. Under an assumed name and burner email address, I contacted them, representing myself as a lurker on the forums who was curious to learn more about the movement. They are tremendously concerned about not being identified. I've omitted identifying details in an acknowledgement of this desire. The meeting place and time wasn't published on the forum and people were asked to, please wear normal street clothes, no men's rights t-shirts, etc. or anything that would identify you as an MRA. Because many people would be meeting in real life for the first time, the group was identified by a Rubik's Cube placed on the pub table. A nod, perhaps, to constant claims of being the voice of rationality and logic. Yes, some of us prefer not to be publicly identified. And I would think the reason pretty obvious. The article I covered in segment 1 of this video, started with the false claim that we are associated with a known mass shooter. Pure propaganda designed to destroy all credibility of the men's rights movement, instead of using fair, unbiased, reasonable arguments, backed up by facts. And here, in segment 2, we have another article that starts by falsely comparing us to anti-Semites and wacky conspiracy theorists. Once again, no reasonable, factual, arguments, backed by evidence, but slander, falsehoods, and propaganda. And by no means are these two articles alone in doing this. In fact, they aren't even the worst examples, as anyone who has seen the previous 10 installments of the series knows. And considering that the only impression many people have of the men's rights movement is formed by these hack journalists, going public could damage future career options. Not to mention that feminists have been extremely successful at associating anti-feminism, with anti-woman. Let's be clear here, feminism is an ideology, female is a gender. They are not the same thing. Oh, and by the way, I think Mr. Daniel is reading way too much into the Rubik's Cube. But I'll let the guys from Men's Rights Sydney clarify in the comments section below if they wish. Next. For the period of time I was there, I wasn't able to stay for the duration. There were 3 acts to the meeting. First, awkward chit-chat as you'd find anywhere people, especially people accustomed to haunting online message boards, meet for the first time. A lot of you probably know me by better my screen name and feeling people out. For example, my weird, geographically indistinct manner of speech was brought up. This was charming in its own way. I could almost convince myself I was amongst people who were into a particularly controversial set of D&D rules they were passionate about and were just super excited to hang out with people of like mind. Yep. Here we go with more rhetoric about men's rights activists being lone internet-dwelling losers. Next. Then, it took the feel of an AA meeting like any you've seen in a Hollywood film. People went around in a circle introducing themselves, how they came to the movement and their place within it. This is where things got unsettling. It became immediately clear the vast majority of these men were deeply wounded. There were stories of schizophrenic mothers, abusive wives, lost or estranged children. It's hard not to imagine their point of view as a way of dealing with this trauma. It's, perhaps, easier to rail against institutions they feel prosecute and punish their shared manhood than deal with the idea that they suffered an injustice, but that injustice may have been meted out capriciously or through the failure of individuals rather than large-scale systems. I, last man to speak, mumbled something about feminism going too far and being just there to learn, which seemed to suffice. In the past, I have worked in tertiary education, and have delivered more than my fair share of training to new classes. I've also taken part in my fair share of training over the years. It's stock standard practice, that when you have a new group of people, who effectively don't know each other, but have to work together, you go around in a circle, introduce yourself, and tell the group a little about who you are, and why you are there. Now I've never been to an AA meeting, but based on what I've seen in TV shows and movies, they use the exact same method. In fact, I assume this method is used just about anywhere, where a new group of people have to get to know each other, and work together. I don't doubt Mr. Daniel would know this. Yet he chooses to paint what happened, not as a normal exercise done by a new group of people, but as a group wounded and damaged, by comparing it to an AA meeting. As for his line, the majority of these men were deeply wounded, well, this is total and utter bullshit. Yes, there were a couple of tragic stories, especially those concerning estranged children, but not everyone had a tragic story. My own account, told just before Mr. Daniel gave his, was, I've always seen a double standard in society when it came to the treatment of males, but I never really started to put the pieces together until I saw what feminism was doing to the online atheist community. This led me to look into things a bit deeper. Then Big Red exploded at the University of Toronto, and I decided to start making videos. Hardly a tragic story from a wounded man, and there were many similar stories around the table. But as for those who told more traumatic stories, I have to ask, what the fuck is wrong with that? For fuck's sake, we as men are told all the fucking time that we are defective, by feminist arseholes, because we don't express our emotions in the approved manner. Yet when some men choose to express some very serious events that have happened in their lives, when they choose to express some very serious emotions, in an environment where they are listened to, and their issues are acknowledged, they get shamed for it by pieces of shit like Kane Daniels, who then uses it to insinuate that men's rights activists are only men's rights activists, because they are in some way defective and in pain. Well, fuck you buddy. This is exactly why we do not need feminism. This is exactly why feminism is toxic. This is exactly why hack journalists can go fuck themselves. But maybe we should hear from Mr. Tom Golden.
So I got the message that, men were not such good things because they couldn't deal with their feelings so much. And it took me this 30 years to come and tell you what I just told you, and we're going to talk about the different ways they do that later on. But the first thing I want to talk about is, why could I not see it at the time? Why could I not see the way these men were healing? What was it that blinded me, and what was it that made it invisible so we couldn't see the men's pain? And the very first thing is, a man's pain is taboo. A man's pain is taboo. You've heard speakers all day today talk about that in certain ways, but a man's pain is taboo. No one wants to touch it. No one wants to hear it. And men are not dumb. They know that. So what are they going to do? Go emote in public? No. They know their pain is taboo. Now, let's do an exercise. I want you to imagine that you're walking into your favorite restaurant. You're walking in your favorite restaurant, you're walking in to get seated, you're thinking, and you look over in the corner, at the corner table, there's a woman. She's crying. What's the first thing you think about with her? Anybody? What's wrong? Poor dear, she's upset, right? I've asked this question to thousands of therapists in the workshops I give. I'm telling you, they all say the same thing. Poor dear, she must have just broken up with someone. She needs support. How can I help, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Erase that image. Go back, you're walking into the same restaurant. You're walking by, and you notice over in that corner table, there's a guy, and he's crying. What's your first reaction? Get away. Wimp. What else? Drunk. Exactly. This is what I hear over and over again. People immediately come up with that. I came up with that, and I was working with them. You know, this is not something that is just a couple of people. This is almost all of us have this bias that's built in that says, man's pain, get away. There's something wrong with that guy. He's probably drunk. You know, so we're all built to not want to get close to men's pain.
I know I've used that clip a bit in recent videos, but it is a really good clip, and the perfect rebuttal to Kane Daniels' paragraph. Not only does Kane admit to being unsettled, the only one at the meeting I might add, but he then turns that pain into a tool to use against the men's rights movement. Yes, it is true there were a couple of tragic stories there, but I didn't see the men relaying these stories as deeply wounded. I saw them as individuals who had had some bad experiences, and were brave enough to talk about those experiences with a group who were not only willing to listen, but non-judgmental as well. Well, apart from Kane Daniel, I have to wonder, if Kane Daniel visited a feminist meeting, and some individuals at the meeting talked about their sexual assault, or some such other event, would Mr. Daniel have written an article claiming that the entire group was deeply wounded, and only turned to feminism out of pain? Somehow, I seriously fucking doubt it. Next. Then, it became organizational. Feeling like a group of first-year uni students gathering to figure out practical ways to make political change. There was much bloviating about the impossibility of doing this through the Labour Party, infested with feminists, you see, and the small amount of highly organized people it would take to sway or appoint a sympathizer to government. Feminism was frequently compared to communism. They acknowledged the more rabid, troublesome edge of the movement, but, worryingly, they did not condemn them. Rather, discussed how to direct their energy towards their goals. The script was largely stuck to, this is a fight for an equality lost, 50-50 custody of children is an overarching goal, sexual violence against men exists. There was talk of how to replicate the success, depending on how you define success, of the Canadian Association for Equality and how to replicate it in Australia. An attempt at Skyping a prominent MRA on a monstrous gaming laptop failed. It was a rambling, unfocused discussion made less clear in my head because of the riot of anxiety generated by my deceit. Yes, someone did suggest that the Labour Party was an ineffective means of change, and I tend to agree, the extreme left is too strong within it. But in my opinion the Liberal Party, Australia's right-wing party for those of you overseas, is just as bad, not overrun with the extreme left obviously, but with the extreme right. Personally I'm a centralist, and I think the further you go to either extreme of left or right, the more fucked up you get. In my opinion, both parties have ideological extremists. As for feminism being compared to communism, well, considering feminism as cultural Marxism, I think the comparison is more than legit.
Were you very angry?
Oh, absolutely furious. Of course we were. We had plenty to be angry about. We still do.
Kill men now, ask me how. It was a badge that we had mass made for a meeting.
I mean, we were pretty tough and probably quite alarming.
Yes, we were bloody angry, and some of us still are.
William, stop it. Come on.
Sorry.
In the late 70s, politics in Britain became more extreme. As the state moved dramatically to the right, the left began to fragment. The women's movement was already an established political force, but now a group of women splintered away from the mainstream of feminist thinking. They called themselves the Revolutionary Feminists. Unlike the socialists, who pictured a revolution where the ruling class and the working class would be on opposite sides of the barricades, revolutionary feminists declared war on men. It all began in Leeds.
Men grow bold as they grow old. They all lose their charms in the end. All men are wankers, said Christabel Pankhurst. Women are a girl's best friend. You have to be enraged. I still have the rage, and I still carry the rage. Rage is absolutely fundamental, not anger, it's not strong enough. It has to be rage.
Sheila Jeffreys came to Leeds as an academic and was the revolutionary feminists' leading ideologue.
I was in socialist feminist groups in the early 70s, and what concerned me about socialist feminism is it wasn't naming men and looking at the power relationship between men and women. It was all what we used to call women and Ireland, women and this, women and that. So I was very concerned to problematise the role of men. I was in a London socialist feminist group with Sandra McNeill, and we wanted to reorientate the politics so that we could look at what men were doing. And that's where revolutionary feminism came from, really.
It was 1978 at the Birmingham plenary when we stepped up to the microphone and said, men are the enemy. Oh, you can't say men are the enemy. You will split the movement wide. We must stick together with the male left. An analysis they will provide. Make the coffee. Mind the baby. Don't make such a bloody fuss. Your oppression is due to capitalism. It's got nothing to do with us.
It was a very straightforward, uncomplicated feminism which proclaimed men as the problem. And it was not poverty, it was not class, it was not race.
Did you define women as a class?
Yes, absolutely. Women were the equivalent of the working class and men the ruling class.
Under patriarchy?
Under patriarchy, that's right. So we hoped to abolish the class difference.
We were told by men on the left that ours was a bourgeois cause, that we had to wait until the proper revolution before we could then say that women deserved liberation. We didn't agree with that. We knew that actually what we deserved was freedom from the tyranny of male oppression, and we were going to get it by any means necessary.
The heterosexual couple is the basic unit of the political structure of male supremacy.
I don't need that fucking shit!
It is more efficient by far than keeping women in ghettos, camps, or even sheds at the bottom of the garden. Any woman who takes part in a heterosexual couple helps to shore up male supremacy by making its foundations stronger.
In 1979, the revolutionary feminists in Leeds wrote a manifesto, arguing that women would only be free if they stopped having sex with men.
Giving up fucking for a feminist is about taking up politics seriously. Women who are socialists are prepared to give up many things which they might enjoy because they see how these things tie into and support the whole system of economic class oppression which they are fighting. They will resist buying Cape apples because the profits go to South Africa.
And for the record, Mr. Daniel, Sheila Jeffreys, who you saw featured in that clip, is a professor of political science at the University of Melbourne, in our home city. But the radicals are only on the fringe, right? Miss Jeffries is somewhat of a controversial character. Not only does she think heterosexual sex is oppression, as you just saw in the clip, but thinks that transsexualism should be seen as a violation of human rights. This is the type of bullshit that the men's rights movement fights against, and that journalists like Kane Daniels will never criticize in any serious way. Next. Through this haze I do clearly remember an attendee leaning in towards me when fedoras somehow came up in conversation. Knowing I was new to all this, he asked whether I was surprised I didn't see the hat, which has become a symbol for nice guys always finish last. Sexual frustration. It's what finding feminism as a personal affront to your own gentlemanliness looks like if it were a hat. Hashtag not all men if it were an ugly piece of felt a couple of inches from your ponytail. See, we don't look like that at all, he said. Or something similar. Except, looking around the table, they looked exactly how I thought they would. Self-awareness has its limits, I guess. So funny. I was the one who made the fedora comment to him. I jokingly said something like, "Where are all the fedoras?" The comment was supposed to point out the bullshit misconceptions that feminists have about us, you know, like all the ones in this article. As for looking like he expected, well, we didn't stand out from anyone else in the pub, and he didn't stand out from us, so I'm not sure exactly what he means. If he is suggesting that we look like an average mix of your average male Melburnians, then I would agree, but I think his comments are once again pretty clearly designed to establish, or maybe I should say, reinforce, a false stereotype. Next. Eventually I had to excuse myself. I shook some hands, took an email address, promised to reach people on the forum. I left shaken. My opinions hadn't been changed, but I was disturbed by how easily anti-feminist rhetoric came out of my mouth, how easy it was to lock into a hateful groove, even if it's a groove you want to be out of as quickly as possible. How the inertia of feeling accepted into something can start to make any opinion sound credible. How the subterfuge came easy, how simple it is to furrow a brow and listen to someone share their pain. How real twinges of empathy stirred within yourself. Which makes me think these men need a support group more than they need a movement. Let me speculate an alternative interpretation. And I do stress, this is speculation, as I obviously don't know Mr. Daniel well, having only met him once, not to mention being deceived by him. But based on the style of his article, and the many similar articles I've read from similarly minded individuals, I think it's safe to speculate that Kane didn't get the story he thought he would. I doubt he's ever taken the time to talk to, or listen to, an MRA before the meeting. I doubt he's ever considered our issues in any unbiased way. In fact, I would speculate he is ignorant of many of our concerns. He certainly didn't mention many of them in his article. I suspect that he was expecting a group of loud, angry individuals, shouting about hating women, and taking away their rights, as many bigots like to paint us. But instead he got a warm welcome. He got men sharing their thoughts, their experiences, and their emotions. And he got a group of men who are interested in confronting and solving social injustices. In other words, he didn't have the hate-filled hit piece he was looking for. So instead, he has resorted to using a mix of shaming language and anti-men's rights stereotypes. I'm a little surprised he didn't throw in the name Elliot Rodger. I at least give him credit for that. And that's about the only thing I can give him credit for. Maybe he should just go back to writing stories about taking a shit at a festival, although I'm sure somehow even that would be turned into some form of patriarchal oppression. After all, everything is, isn't that right, Kane?
Wow.
We
have to congratulate the Vice reporters for their sleuthing. You know, like they found a forum in a public space that was open to the public, and they infiltrated it.
I don't want to hear from us. We're all rape apologists.
Let me say a little bit more about this, though, because it was kind of interesting. I'm actually in contact with a lot of the people, or at least a couple of the people who were at said meeting, and they were utterly shocked. They're like, what? They're like, there's an article about this? We just chilled out at a pub. We were talking about opening a chapter of, for Melbourne, and, this guy did seem a little bit off and a little bit sketchy, so we already were thinking, okay, this is a little bit weird. We don't know who this person is. And they said he didn't stay very long. He only stayed for a little bit of it. And they're like, oh, gosh, really? Yeah. It was really ridiculous.
He probably wasn't getting the story he wanted.
Yeah, they basically just went to the pub, had basic discussions, like why they're there, how they came to be in the MRM and things like that. And it was just basic stuff from what I understand. And I think the general portrayal was that they were all angry white men. And there were people in the comments saying, like, I'm not white. And I have some legitimate issues. Heaven forbid, like, guys should want to see their kids and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Then that sexist jerk went back and wrote about anti-feminism and said not a word about uncle feminism.